Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution, area of study 1. In this video we're going to look at institutional weaknesses and tensions in Tsarist Russia, from and including the 1905 revolution right up until the February 1917 revolution. We'll begin by looking at institutional weaknesses, and the biggest institutional weakness within Russia at this time was the bureaucracy. And the people saw the bureaucracy. They held it in contempt as corrupt and inefficient. In Father Gapon's petition, which he tried to present to the Tsar in January 1905, he wrote during that infamous day of Bloody Sunday, "The entire working people and the peasants are subjected to the arbitrariness of a bureaucratic administration composed of embezzlers of public funds and thieves, who not only have not concern at all for the interests of the Russian people, but who harm those interests. The bureaucratic administration has reduced the country to complete destitution, drawn it into a shameful war, and brings Russia ever further towards ruin." Apart from the bureaucracy itself, the police played a key role in keeping tensions or disorder to a minimum within Russia, and the people themselves did not have a lot of respect for the police and the police state itself. The police state was made up of three different groups. The Okhrana, and their task was to protect the Tsar and the imperial family and the government from radical criticisms and plots to kill them. So when we're talking about radical criticisms, we're talking about revolutionaries and liberals criticising the Tsarist regime and demanding change to the system of government, for example, maybe getting rid of the Tsar altogether. The other group who played a key role in enforcing the will of the Tsar within this police state were the Cossacks, and they were a semi-autonomous military group of elite horse tribesmen. They were loyal to the Tsar, and they were used as shock troops to disperse protests. They played a role in the 1905 revolution. They also played a key role in the February 1917 revolution. And finally, the final group were the gendarmes, and their main duties were law enforcement. So all of these three groups, they repressed the people. They crushed all criticism and opposition with equal brutality within Russia. And this created within Russia a desperate extremism amongst Russian radicals, who saw no point seeking moderate solutions to Russia's problems. And when we're talking about Russian radicals, we're talking about, for example, the populists, that extreme wing of the populist movement, the People's Will, who were responsible for a number of assassinations of government ministers and so forth, as well as other groups such as the Bolsheviks. So this repression which the Tsar enforced upon the people, it contributed to the formation of revolutionary groups such as the People's Will, as well as the Bolsheviks. It drove many intellectuals into the arms of these revolutionary groups and swelled their ranks and increased their popularity within Russia. And we can see that there. So intellectuals and students, many of them joined these revolutionary groups. Most of the leaders in the Bolshevik movement were highly educated. Lenin, Trotsky, they had been to university, and they saw the inequality in Russian society, as well as the repression dealt upon the people, and that's why they joined these groups. Okay, let's have a look at tensions in Tsarist Russia now. So tensions in Tsarist Russia arose for a number of reasons. In particular, there was a lack of freedom of expression, and there was a refusal to reform on the part of Tsar Nicholas II. His opposition to reform sprang from the fact that his grandfather, Alexander II, was assassinated. And Alexander II had tried to liberalise Russian society in a number of ways, and as a reward for that attempt to liberalise Russian society, he was killed by revolutionaries. In response to this, Alexander III, the following Tsar Nicholas II's father, he instituted the reaction and Tsar Nicholas II continued the reaction. So the reaction were a group of repressive policies. And one of those, for example, included the Statute of State Security, which established special government-controlled courts outside the existing legal system. It removed judges with liberal views and sympathies, and it increased the powers of the Okhrana and tightened press censorship. So this reaction was put in place to strengthen Tsarist rule and to stop any opposition towards that rule. The other key policy which contributed to tensions in Tsarist Russia at this time and tried to put an end to any attempts to reform Tsarist or Russian society, was Russification. And Russification was the promotion of all things Russian. It repressed non-Russian minorities. It discouraged non-Russian minorities such as the Poles, the Jews, the Ukrainians and Muslims from using their language, as well as practicing their culture, and even trying to stop them from following their own religion and so forth. This Russification also led to pogroms, which were carried out mostly by Cossacks against Jews in places like the Ukraine, where there was a big Jewish population. So the policies of the reaction and Russification increased social tension by making the intelligentsia and ethnic minorities critical of the Tsar. So Stalin, for example, I believe he was a Georgian, and he joined the Bolsheviks as a consequence of, from his view anyway, being repressed by the regime when he was a teenager and a child. This contributed to an increase in support for liberal and revolutionary groups. The Jews also played prominent roles in many of the revolutionary organisations, the Mensheviks, as well as the Bolsheviks, Trotsky being probably the most famous example of that, and many of these Jewish intellectuals had joined these revolutionary groups as well as a consequence of Russification. Okay, now let's have a look at tensions within specific social groups within Tsarist Russia. So we'll begin with workers in the cities. The workers had benefited initially under Witt's policies, economic policies in the Great Spurt, where industry had developed quickly in the late 19th century in Russia, and there had been more and more jobs created within the cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and many peasants flocked to these cities to get work. They became workers. However, a recession hit in the late 1890s, and that lasted until 1907, and it led to mass unemployment and poverty. And as a consequence of this mass unemployment and poverty, workers striked a lot. And you can see there in 1905, there were 13,995 strikes during that 1905 revolution. So this unemployment and poverty increased social tension further. Workers were also angry about the fact that their working conditions were very, very poor. And the Tsar refused to alleviate these working conditions and make it easier for workers. So you can see, for example, there, the Tsar refused to implement the 8-hour working day. And this unemployment and this refusal by the Tsar to implement positive reforms for workers contributed to both the 1905 revolution and the February 1917 revolution. They were contributing factors to why the workers joined these revolutions en masse. Let's now have a look at peasants in the countryside. They suffered as a consequence of land shortages. So there was not enough fertile land for peasants due to the population. So Russia is a big, big country. However, not all of the land was fertile and useful for farming. And I've got a stat there, and I took it from Richard Pipes. And it shows how this problem with land shortages increased throughout this period. So according to Richard Pipes, the average allotment per male peasant in 1861 was 5.24 hectares. This shrank to 3.83 hectares in 1880 and then 2.84 hectares in 1900. So between 1861 and 1900, peasants had about half as much land to grow food upon and to help to grow the food that their families needed to survive. And you can see there, this parcel of land was insufficient for a peasant family to live on, so they had to lease extra land from other rich peasants and landlords. And when they were leasing this extra land, they were getting indebted as a consequence. So land prices became too high, even though peasants could buy land as a result of the Emancipation Decree of 1861, when they were freed from their serfdom. And this led many peasants into poverty. Many peasants were overburdened by high mortgage repayments, which they couldn't pay. And then this was exacerbated by poor harvests between 1897 and 1901, which brought famine. And Witt's economic reforms, which I referred to before, Witt had focused on improving industry and not agriculture. So his economic reforms did nothing to improve the lot of peasant farmers within Russia at this time. So another key reason why the peasants revolted during this period, apart from poverty and the famines and so forth, was that they feared that the government was going to repossess their homes because they couldn't repay the mortgages that they had taken out. And in the 1905 revolution, for example, peasant revolts broke out in the Kursk province. They spread to the Volga region and then most of the Black Earth provinces. And those Black Earth provinces is that Black Earth strip of land that goes pretty much all the way through southern or the Ukraine south to the Ukraine through to the Caucasus region. So landlords' houses and properties were seized during the revolts. These revolts in the 1905 revolution, and you can see that good stat there, nearly 3,000 manors were destroyed. 15% of the total number of manor houses that existed in Russia at this time were destroyed by the peasants when they seized their land, and I got that figure from Orlando Fige. Okay, let's have a look now at a couple of historical interpretations about tensions in Tsarist Russia. And the focus of these two historical interpretations is this policy of Russification, which was implemented by the Tsar. And the first one is from Orlando Fige, and he writes, "More than anything else, it was this policy of Russification, pursued increasingly by the last two Tsars, that politicized the nationalist movements and turned them into enemies of Russia. By 1905, nationalist parties had emerged as a major revolutionary force in most of the non-Russian borderlands." And our second historical interpretation is from the HCPSU, and it writes, "Tsarist Russia was a prison of nations. The numerous non-Russian nationalities were entirely devoid of rights and were subjected to constant insult and humiliation of every kind. The Tsarist government taught the Russian population to look down upon the native peoples of the national regions as an inferior race, officially referred to them as aliens, and fostered contempt and hatred of them. The Tsarist government deliberately fanned national discord." So that's a key quote there. "Instigated one nation against another, engineered Jewish pogroms, and in Transcaucasia incited Tatars and Armenians to massacre each other. Nearly all, if not all, government posts in the national regions were held by Russian officials. All business and government institutions and in the courts was conducted in the Russian language. It was forbidden to publish newspapers and books in the languages of the non-Russian nationalities, or to teach in the schools in the native tongue. The Tsarist government strove to extinguish every spark of national culture and pursued a policy of forcible Russification. Tsardom was a hangman and torturer of the non-Russian peoples." And there's a second key quote there, an easy one for you to remember if you're writing about Russification on the exam. Okay, so that is our video on institutional weaknesses and tensions in Tsarist Russia. I hope you find this useful for your study of the Russian Revolution, Area of Study 1, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.